New diary. This is not for the internet. Not even anonymously. Not even on a private, password protected server. Not even for a computer that someone could conceivably one day plug into an Ethernet cable. If you wanted to psychoanalyze me, well, you wouldn't be the first. First of all, that would be my mother. But if you did, I'm sure you could trace it as far back into my childhood as you felt poetically inclined, as deeply into my subconscious as you dared to delve. But as far as I can tell, sitting here at the top of the iceberg, as it were, this acute obsession began last summer on a trip I took with my mother to Papua New Guinea. The trip was a grad school graduation gift. I was used to eating beans and ignoring the sounds of the cockroaches on the floor after I was already in bed and too tired to get up and chase them around. And all of a sudden, I was flying business class. I had a driver and men waiting on me. It wasn't quite like those expeditions of old that you read about. Livingstone walking into the bush with 100 local porters schlepping all his shit. We had only our one guide, and each of us our day packs on our backs. But we were on a boat going upriver and, as far as I could tell, at least, farther away from anything you might call civilization than I'd ever been, or had ever really cared to be. I thought that our safari hotel was in the boonies to begin with. And then we were in the Range Rover at 5 in the morning for a 2-hour drive into nothingness just to get to the boat launch. You can't help but marvel at the thought of anyone coming all the way out there into the raw jungle and building the road we used. We boarded the boat, and I spent the entire morning with one eye on the canopy, petrified at the thought of one of those reptiles with the long tails, or, God help me, the snakes, dropping on our heads. Not to sound ungrateful, the other eye was marveling at all the other stuff that we saw. And I was totally in awe at the, you know, great variety and creativity of Mother Nature. What can I say? Creepy crawlies give me the creepy crawlies. It's not a personal judgment. I love all of God's creatures. It's just evolution. All of that is to say, my nerves were already beginning to fray by the middle of the day, when the sun occupied the relatively narrow band of blue sky we could see between the walls of trees. Almost all at once, even I, novice outdoors woman that I am, noticed that the jungle seemed to go quiet. You don't notice how loud it is until it's not. I looked at our guide and he just grinned at me, very wide grin, and nodded. Not at all reassuring. I remember one of the customer reviews reading. I heard my mom gasp and then turned to look where she was pointing. It took me a second to see what I was looking at, and once I did, I wondered how they had ever eluded me to begin with, which made me wonder how long they had been there, and how many more there might be along the banks, hiding in plain view. Dark skin, bare chests, with bright accents on their skirts, and armbands and headdresses, their eyes and teeth glowing in the leafy shadows, watching us. It took me a moment longer to notice the bows and spears, all cocked and taut, aimed right at us. I also noticed that our guide was no longer smiling. He was sweating and brow furrowing, an amount that made me quite uneasy indeed. He said, "They shouldn't be this far upriver for at least another week," mostly to himself, checking his watch, though I assume, because he spoke it in English, that he intended for us to hear it. He put his binoculars to his face and adjusted the focus and grimaced. Then, finally, He looked me in the eye. He half whispered it, half mouthed it, but I understood instantly. A word which gripped my heart with an icy hand and has not let it go for a moment since. Cannibals. Sure enough, the closer I scanned to the banks, the more eyeballs I saw, the more spears and clubs and axes, poised and terribly, terribly tangible. I can still remember the detail in the constructions, the textures of the materials, the way the light reflected off the carved bamboo, dulled by handling. Imagining the heft and weight of the rock splitting my skull open.
"Food," said the guide, motioning at my pack. I fumbled with the zipper a bit, and he started motioning with both hands, like it was some kind of big hurry. We were floating closer to the man I took to be the chief, who was standing right on the shore, waiting for us. I reached for a banana. First reasonable thing that caught my eye, but it turns out my instincts were all wrong. The guide shook his head and tossed it into the river and took the bag to look for himself. He found a sleeve of Oreos and tore it open. He held one up for the people on the shore to see, and then the chief beckoned for us to bring it to him. The image still gives me goosebumps. It could have been a frog or something, but I'm fairly certain I heard our guide gulp. He gave one cookie to me and one to my mother, and intimated that it should be us who made the offering. He put a paddle in the water and steered us over to where the chief was waiting. I could tell, even from a distance, that the guy was huge. At least 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered and bulky in the way of a reliable old plow animal. As we came a little closer, I could see the markings painted all over his torso, the piercings dotting his face and ears. The scars blazed up and down his arms. He was staring right at me, whether I would meet his eyes or not. The water carried us steadily closer, as if the man possessed an irresistible gravity, drawing our pathetic, helpless little craft right to his feet. And while my logical, society brain's frantic pep talk cycled through every trick in the book words could muster to convince me otherwise, my stomach and spine were absolutely certain I was floating into the open maw of a crocodile. I was serving them up on a platter for death, and not even allowing them the dignity of screaming or kicking for fear of violating some social faux pas. Makes you wonder how many have gone out that way throughout the ages. Their nervous system desperately trying to drag them down into the mud of the real world, while their mind clings to its comfortable world of ideas and notions. The castle in the clouds full of rooms and corridors it has spent years constructing and decorating, worrying about the decorum and dignity and microaggressions, while some guy is splitting my small intestine open with his incisors. His teeth were whiter than mine, and I did not die, to the great bewilderment of my sympathetic nervous system. We each handed over the cookies we'd been given, and he received them. He could have palmed my head like a basketball. He held one of the Oreos between his thumb and forefinger, and then pulled it apart and sniffed the cream. His brow furrowed and his lip curled. He tried to lick it but once, and then crumbled both of them and dropped them into the water. I'd never seen my mom's face so bloodless. "Oh no," said our guide. And then he put Pole in water and pushed off, muttering, "We have to go now," and a bunch of other stuff in his native tongue, which I thought sounded like prayers. I could feel the eyes on us from both shores for minutes as we floated away, until we finally rounded a bend and were out of sight. though. I never stopped scanning the tree line and imagining. Eventually, we stopped at a sandy bank and went ashore for lunch. That was the end of the line, as it turned out. Through the trees, there was an outhouse and a garbage can, and farther back down a short trail, a small parking lot with a couple of tour company vans. The meal had been prepared by a chef and placed in a picnic basket for us. It was included in the cost of our expedition. Roast beef sandwiches with fancy mayonnaise and a pickle spear. The potato salad was mustard-based and a bit spicy. My mother said it was the best she'd ever eaten. It all tasted like clay to me. Wet lumps to push around with my tongue and mash and reform with my teeth. My body was grateful for the nutrition, but my mind was still on the boat, still reeling from beneath those hungry stares. I turned the word over on its head, flipped it front to back, back to front, feeling each silent consonant on my tongue and lips. Cannibal. After lunch, we boarded one of the vans and waved goodbye to our guide and were ferried back toward whence we'd come. We'd been on the road for maybe 10 or 15 minutes when my mother starts rifling through her purse. And I can tell right away that something's wrong. So I ask. "The guidebook," she says, and throws her purse down in frustration. "I must have left it back there." Our driver, to his credit, not demonstrating even a moment of annoyance, turned the van around at our request. When we pulled back into the parking lot a few minutes later, our guide was still there. He was leaning on the runner of an unmarked pickup truck, talking to the driver. I waved as I jumped out to grab the book and then realized that I recognized a few of the people in the truck. The guy in the passenger seat especially. It was the chief, wearing a dirty t-shirt and a faded Dodgers cap. Our eyes met once more, this time through the reflection of the sun on the windshield. His were utterly barren of the charisma they'd held on the bank of the river, almost unrecognizable, like a boy with his hand caught in the cookie jar. They drove away quickly after that, and our guide made some effort to explain or obfuscate, but it only confirmed what I had seen. "I suppose there's at least part of me that can see how it makes sense for all parties," my mother said back at the hotel that evening while we readied ourselves for dinner. According to the clerk at the front desk, there were no known tribes of cannibals left living anywhere a tourist might expect to end up, and hadn't been for at least 100 years. "They gave all that up when the cities started to move closer," he said. "Now some of them dress up like that for the tourists. They make a little cash on the side, and the tourists get to advertise themselves as authentic." She finished applying her lipstick, stuck it in her clutch, and turned off the light over the vanity. "I still have half a mind to ask for our money back, though." It was only about a month after Papua New Guinea that I saw her again, this time with my dad and brother at our cousin's wedding. In memory, it feels like at least a year must have passed between the two events. I was a completely changed person. Or maybe I was the same person, but I'd sprouted a second head. Or maybe it was just the world had changed around me, while I spent most of the intervening 4 weeks holed up in my one-bedroom apartment, where I was living out the remainder of the lease, and doing odd jobs for my old professors to pay for groceries. I watched so many fake snuff videos that I was picking them out in the first 5 seconds. I could sometimes tell by the file name alone, but I always hit play anyways, just in case. There are certainly real ones out there, if you know where and how to look, but they're harder to come by than you'd expect. Especially if you're not trying to spend big money, and once you've seen them, you've seen them. None of them ever really left me satisfied. never showed what I really wanted to see. But then, maybe what I really wanted wasn't something that a video could give me. I read every first-hand account I could find. Again, there were plenty of phonies to filter through. Probably even more, since it took even less effort and no video camera or special effects. Chops for any 12-year-old with an edgy sense of humor to type up a forum post about eating his entire family. These were obviously easy enough to pick out. But the fact that even most of the credible posts, the realistic ones, the nuanced and shaded ones clearly written by adults like me, could never truly be verified, was a source of perpetual anguish. Not that the anguish prevented me from spending hours upon hours reading and rereading them, printing out my favorites to keep on my bedside for fast reference and gratification of whatever these urges were. And they were never really gratified, was the horrible thing that I realized early on. Not fully. I found recipes, probably more joke cookbooks and tips to sift through here than in any other area of my research. Certainly nothing from Bon Appetit or the New York Times, though I read people who recommended transposing some of their instructions for various pork dishes. Even the earnest original efforts left me highly skeptical as to whether the author had ever actually consumed, let alone cooked, human flesh. Growing up, I was never a very adventurous eater. In fact, my mother would tell you that I was the pickiest eater she'd ever known. I have some memory of a period when if you came to me with something other than peanut butter and jelly or chicken nuggets, good luck. But even later in life, I've never been one to venture outside of a fairly narrow comfort zone, I'll admit. I like what I like. Any time we were ever out at a fancy restaurant or on vacation in an exotic place, and there was some strange or novel item on the menu, it was always my mother who would order it, while my dad and brother and I gawked in horror and ate our French fries. I landed in New Orleans the afternoon before the wedding, and spent the night out on the town with some other cousins I hadn't seen in years. We first went for dinner, to a perfectly lovely little spot in the Garden District, and afterward to the Quarter for drinks, which was less to my taste. Although, at our first stop, a pretty cute guy named Eric, or Aaron, approached me and offered to buy my drink, and we spent the next 15 or 20 minutes chatting. He was not uncharming, though I also was not beside myself to leave him behind when my cousins indicated that they were ready to move to the next portion of our evening. I gave him my number and let him kiss me on the cheek, and we parted ways. I'd rented a car, so the following morning, with the sun still coming up, I drove a few of the cousins out of the city, headed east toward Mobile. It was at the end of August, or maybe the first week of September. Sweltering by 9. Air conditioner at full blast. The couple were to be wed at a beach house owned by a member of the groom's extended family on a tiny, remote little spit of land out in the Gulf at the end of a chain of islands, which were connected like pearls on a necklace along a main causeway by a series of beam bridges. We drove along the coast for hours, and there was nary a cloud in the sky to protect us from the sun. My cousin Delaney woke up in the back seat after a long nap and saw the waves lapping at the concrete pylons beneath us, and shrieked. I don't do great with bridges either. I always want to drive off them. The first and largest island had a couple of hotels, a grocery store, a main drag full of various shops, and we were still, according to our GPS, a little over an hour away from the venue. There was a mini golf course on the second island, a church on the third, and so on, with fewer and fewer houses on each successive quay, until there wasn't much but a gas station, charging almost $7 a gallon and a roadside crab stand. There was also a shack claiming to be a boat rental operation, but there was nobody around to rent a boat from, and, as far as I could see, no boats to rent. The bridge to our destination island was noticeably longer than the last few we'd gone over. The house came into view before we had 4 wheels back on dry land. Gleaming white siding, slate gray roof. It dominated what seemed, at first glance, to be barely more than a sandbar. 3 stories of regularly space-shuttered windows, the top row shaded by a substantial eave, all facing the sea. And the architecture bent maybe 15 or 20 degrees at either wing, as if to receive it. It seemed to be half the length of a football field, which is probably an exaggeration, but not a big one. There were already chairs set out in formation facing the archway where the couple would take their vows. A long catering table. As we approached, we could see maybe a dozen people milling about outside in tuxedos and long shimmering dresses carrying cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. They all looked so dramatic, outlined against the massive sky, the ocean wind blowing through their hair. One of the uncles was humoring a pack of young'uns in beach soccer. It was a lovely wedding. There might have been 200 people there. I'd be hard-pressed to name 200 people that I know well enough to know where to send the save the date. But right from the start, I noticed that everyone wanted to talk about the storm. I'd somehow remained blissfully unaware, as had, I presumed, the people who rode in my car, considering it never came up, but there was, apparently, a Category 4 with potential to become a Category 5 hurricane, expected to make landfall as early as Monday evening. Everyone had seen a different prediction, a different model that had the eye of the thing scraping Houston, one where it passed directly over Biloxi, another where it hit the armpit of Florida. In almost every one, our little stretch got noticeably, theoretically, walloped. They were calling it Maud. Lord knows they don't have half the folks they need to man those weather stations anymore, said one woman. Everyone around pursed their lips, and looked down into their drinks and nodded. Budget cuts, said someone else. I feel like I spent most of the reception walking slow laps around the property and through the house. There was so much to see, so much ground to cover. All of the talk about the storm, it had been in the news for a week. Who knew? Imbued the entire evening with a nervous, almost giddy energy, underlying all the usual wedding emotions. It was like we were all collectively playing chicken with nature. And yet, to the eye, the day was clear and sunny, all blue skies. And as night fell, the stars stole the show. I remarked to someone I was talking to about how quiet it was, at least away from the music. About how I wanted to just lay there all night, basking in the sound of the waves. Just make sure you're back to the mainland by morning, he said. The high tide, it seemed, washed out several of the connecting bridges. And with the storm coming, depending on how bad it was, many of them could be impassable for days, if not a week. It was a novel thing for me to be out in one of the estuaries of the world, of modern life, where human civilization and technology have not managed full subjugation of nature, and it must still be considered, consulted, accommodated. I couldn't even remember the last place I'd been besides P&G where I didn't have cell service, and even there it was pretty reliable. The inside of the house was sparsely furnished. It had been done up for the wedding, but was clearly unoccupied otherwise. In my very unstructured, self-guided tour, I came to a library, which would have surprised me in most modern houses, even of this size. But considering the beautifully carved cherry wood molding, and the way the old floors creaked and groaned beneath your feet, it did not seem at all out of place. My eye was immediately drawn to a large painting on the far wall, in an ornate gilt frame. It was bright and grand. It depicted a concourse of sorts, in the foreground of this broad, ancient cityscape, full of big columns and gleaming domes. It was one of those paintings with so much going on that you could probably stand there and study it for an hour. There, at the bottom, is a general, being carried along in an orgiastic triumph. Ships sail in and out of the harbor above, and there's the queen, in all her grandeur, amidst blooming plants and sparkling fountains, off in the corner with her retinue, watching the parade. There's the trumpeters, the boy amongst the onlookers and admirers, calling for his mother. The mind just starts making up stories about all of these people. It's automatic, unthinking. You toss a few dabs of paint in a familiar or suggestive enough way, and our reflexes kick in. Before long, they've got an overbearing mother and an aloof father. Their broken leg when they were 9, and it never healed quite right. They found out that morning that they didn't get the promotion they deserved. And once they're there, as a fleshed-out person, no matter what our thinking minds try to interject, our body doesn't really know to treat them any differently than anyone else we might know. At least, not while we're looking at the paint people. There was someone in the doorway behind me. I'm not sure how exactly I knew. A subtle shift in the shadows. Maybe I smelled his pheromones. But I wasn't caught off guard when he spoke. It was an older man, portly, with white hair and glasses, carrying half a whiskey sour. He had a warm smile. "Pretty marvelous, huh?" he said by way of an introduction. "It's so vivid," I said. "Benny's uncle saw it at a museum in New York while he was there as a student and fell in love. He promised himself he'd have reproductions of the whole series made when he had the money and a place to hang them." "It's a pretty nice spot," I agree. I look at the carved brass placard on the bottom of the frame. Consummation of Empire. "The others are around here somewhere," he said. Outside, a strong gust of wind off the ocean rattled the shutters and whistled around beneath the eave. "He's not worried about them here with the storm coming?" The man took a sip of his drink and waved off my concern. "She's sturdy. Some of the finest craftsmen in the country built this place, way back in the Depression, when they were looking for any job they could find. They knew how to build things back then." He took another sip. "They still do. Or at least a few folks do, I presume. Trouble is, they figured out faster and cheaper ways to do things. And now they don't let you do it the old way anymore." "They don't let you?" I asked. "I mean, you might try. Then see how fast the board and the shareholders run you out of town and replace you with someone who will do it faster and cheaper. That's all anyone's job is these days. When you drill through all the jargon, faster and cheaper. Finding costs to save and corners to cut, right?" "I guess so," I said, still thinking about it. I was trying to discern how drunk he was, if at all. I'm a terrible judge of those things sometimes. I'll have entire conversations with someone, and afterward my friend will be like, "Wow, they were so high." And I'll be like, "Huh?" I imagine it's because I'm so in my own head, or self-conscious of how I'm coming off, to notice those details in others. Sometimes I wonder if everyone else is like me in that regard. Everyone's so caught up in themselves that they're barely noticing the other person. Just enough to register a first impression to interact with for the rest of the night. Like two ships passing. each captain furiously pacing the deck, fretting over what the other is thinking of them. Outside, they were cutting the cake. We both agreed that we better get out there. I think at least as much to ease us out of the conversation as opposed to any feeling of obligation or sentimentality. Maybe that's another one that's just me, though. I try to assume other people are basically like me, but I'm regularly confronted with evidence to the contrary. I danced for a bit with the cousins I'd come with. When I went inside for drinks, I found a bunch of people gathered in what I reflectively called the living room, though it seems a bit silly. Living room conjures images of shag carpets and entertainment stands. If I could compare it to anything, it might be something more like a hunting lodge, with a big flagstone fireplace and everyone laying about on wide leather couches beneath the high ceiling with the big wooden beams. No heads on the wall, though. Just a painting over the mantel that reminded me of the one in the library in size and technique, but was an almost entirely green landscape. I moseyed into the back of the standing room only crowd. A woman closer to the center was talking about riding out Hurricane Sandy in her West Village loft. I lost power for like 3 days. It was crazy. Some of the streets you could take a boat down. Like there was water in the subways. Sure, said someone else in the crowd. But in New York, they just call that last one Tuesday. Everyone laughed. The painting was a pastoral scene. Mid-morning in summer, the flock with the shepherd, the farmer in the field, revelers dancing and merrymaking beneath a big tree. Y'all know about the 1900 storm, of course, said an older man sitting by the fire in a rumpled suit. He looked like a hard 50, twisted a toothpick between his teeth. Was just this time of year, in fact. He checked his watch briefly. Almost to the day. I'll be damned. My grandparents was there. Water was 15 feet high. Watched it rise 4 feet in 4 seconds. Shoot! He flicked the toothpick into the fire. Y'all know about that orphanage, I imagine. St. Mary's? 103 people, 93 orphans and 10 nuns, sitting in the dormitory, watching the water come closer and closer, singing, Help then, sweet queen, in our exceeding danger. By thy 7 griefs, in pity, lady, save. Think of the babe that slept within the manger, and help us now, dear lady of the wave. The room was so quiet when he stopped that all you could hear was the crackle of the fire and the tide on the beach outside rolling in and out. When they realized the dormitory was fixing to collapse, the sisters tied all the young'uns to the clothesline, and then tied that around their waist. Was only 3 older boys went unfixed. They was the only 3 that lived. You could hear the house shifting in the wind, the boards groaning. Outside, a cheer went up for something. That helped to dispel the trance of gloom that had taken hold of us. At least a little. Well, that settles it, said someone on the couch nearest me. I just booked my flight to Ohio. People chuckled at that. And then it was okay for everyone to look around for someone else to talk to, somewhere else to be. Haven't you heard of lake hurricanes? Said someone as we were all dispersing. About half as many people were still engaged enough to offer him a chuckle. I lingered in order to get a closer look at the painting. As the crowd cleared, I could see a rifle hanging below the painting, just above the mantel. My friend from upstairs had also lingered. Just missing the horn, right? I said. Like for the powder? Oh no. It's a breech loader, he said. You mean it's real? I asked. Or like, not an antique, I mean. Bill claims to hunt with it whenever he's down here. What is there to shoot around here? Seagulls? The man shrugged. He was never a hunter before he bought this place. Never even owned a gun. He glanced around to make sure we were alone and nudged open the drawer on a side table near the fireplace. There were maybe a dozen bullets rolling around. Outside, I found the lights up and the festivities in the midst of a great, drawn-out winding down. Lots of hugging and au revoiring. I doubled back to the house. As far as I could tell, it was empty. But I found myself tiptoeing around regardless. I found a first-story bathroom with exactly what I was looking for. An inconspicuous window that I could crawl through. I unlocked it and slipped a sleeve of matches from the bowl on the counter underneath to prop it open. Then I went out and found the cousins I'd come with. We said our goodbyes and drove back to our hotel in New Orleans. It was almost 1 when we got there. All of us cousins said goodnight, and in the morning I saw them off to the airport. I told them that I had a later flight, which was true, but I didn't mention that I had no intention of being on it. I tried to fall back asleep, but when that didn't work, I went down to the lobby for a muffin and cereal and an orange, which was all fine, although I probably would not have gotten dressed for it if I'd known that that was all that would be available. After eating, I finished packing and killed some time lying around on my phone. I sent a text to Eric or Aaron. Hey, are you around? Free to grab dinner tonight? He texted back quite fast. Hey, great to hear from you. I'm around. Supposed to go to a friend's thing, but they won't miss me. Do you like seafood? His eagerness kind of put me off the thought of sleeping with him. Like I said, he was attractive enough, but just looking at someone wasn't enough to let me know if I would or not. Maybe my reflexive rejection of the very concept of his enthusiasm for me was a counterproductive trait, and that's something that can be discussed with my therapist at a later date, in a much different context. But it wasn't like I was looking for a husband, and I only planned to go to bed with him if absolutely necessary anyways. We met at a place on Frenchman Street, but our table wasn't ready yet, so we went for a walk around the block to kill time. We passed a jazz band, and a solo saxophonist, and a guitarist with a harp. We passed an antique dealer with a 5-foot-tall painting of Napoleon on one wall that caught his eye. I asked him if he wanted to go inside and poke around, and his face lit up. The place was packed wall to wall, and then some with expensive-looking 19th century tchotchkes and knickknacks. The shopkeeper let us know he was closing in 15 minutes. I could have spent a day there looking at the old globes and armoires. I found a rack of swords on the wall and took a shine to one. A bit shorter, more my size, with a carved pattern on the handle and a gold tassel hanging off. It had a pleasing curve to it. To my great surprise, so much so that I had to ask him to repeat himself, he asked me if I wanted it. Really? What is it? For 200? Yeah, sure. Every girl should have a sword. It's a perfect size for you. I hesitated. It was bizarre. I picked up lots of things in odds and ends shops like this that I didn't need to own. But how many gift swords does one come across in one's life? E pluribus unum was engraved in the handguard. In the end, I let him buy it for me, and he seemed happy to do so. I'll admit that there was a satisfying feeling to its heft, its balance, the way the grip fit in my hand. I got a little carried away waving it around and the shopkeeper gave us a dirty look on our way out the door. We wrapped it and placed it in the trunk of the rental. The city was somehow twice as full as it had been when I'd arrived on Thursday, and it had seemed pretty full then. I brought it up at dinner, at the first lull in our conversation. I think the storm gets the air particles all charged up, and people just start feeling antsy and nervous. And they don't know what to do with themselves, so they want to go party and be around other people while they still can. Because just sitting around and waiting can be unbearable. The presence of death makes them feel alive, I said. Alarm bells started going off when I ordered a cocktail, and he asked for just a water, please. The entire time I'd known the guy had been in a bar. Are you sure you don't want a beer or anything? I asked. Drinks on me. I gave him my best smile. No thanks, he said. It doesn't have to be like a weird feminism or patriarchy thing or whatever, I said. I could feel the waitress inching away. Really, it's all right, he said. Any chance the dinner had at not being awkward seemed to go out the window right there. It was still fine, pleasant enough, but when it was over and we were standing outside beneath the moths and the streetlights, the idea of one of us asking the other if we wanted the night to continue or, God, head back to one or the other of our places seemed about as natural as asking if he could give me a ride back home to California. We hugged, and when we stepped back, he gave me a curt, pursed-lipped nod, and we each stalled a second to see who would look away first. It was him. Which, to be honest, kind of hurt me a bit. Trust me, I don't understand it either. I mean, I was thankful he did it, but I'm not even worth a Hail Mary? He dropped his other plans on a dime for me, and I'd been that lackluster? I walked a block. I didn't know where I was going. I just went in the opposite of whatever direction he went. I stopped and looked at my phone and thought that there had to have been a mistake by at least an hour, if not 2. We'd been talking much longer than I realized. I looked around and found the streets essentially deserted for blocks in every direction. Empty balconies all up and down the row, blank house faces shut up against the stillness, and the fog lingering in the gardens and courtyards. The whole place was transformed, and it gave me a chill in spite of the balmy evening air. I could smell the river. The sound of my own footsteps echoing on the cobblestones made me uneasy. Far too loud. It wasn't long before I really was wishing that Eric, or Aaron, I'd never actually learned his name. Asking him when he showed up to the date I asked him on was out of the question. But in a text hardly seemed better after a certain point. Whatever his name was, it would have been nice to have him walking beside me right then. But I had business to attend to, now that Plan A had fallen through. It was for the best anyways, and I found myself relieved. Like when you can't decide something, so you flip a coin and pick a side and see how it makes you feel when it comes up one way or the other. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Just not my type. Or maybe, if we'd met under different circumstances. Who could say? Besides, I'd texted him. From my very much registered phone number. My stomach sank and released something frigid into my veins like an octopus inking. I couldn't believe I'd overlooked something like that. It meant I wasn't thinking straight. And that led me, naturally, to wonder what else I wasn't thinking about clearly. You almost can't know, definitionally, can you? Or else you wouldn't think it. What if I'd gone through with it, and then had the realization after? I began scanning the gutters and alleys, looking for anyone who looked feasibly homeless. I thought it would be much easier than it actually turned out to be. You look past something 1,000 times a day, and then the one time you actually go looking for it, it's nowhere to be found. Go figure. The first person I found that I thought might fit the bill was this wiry, graying guy digging through a dumpster, all scruffy and kind of mangy looking. He stared at me constantly from the moment I introduced myself with these wide eyes. So bulging, I thought that he was pulling my leg for the first couple of minutes. I offered him $5 and a pack of cigarettes, and he started following me. But after a few blocks, a feeling of dread and wrongness started to creep into my stomach. Maybe he was tweaking, or strung out. Maybe this was a bad idea too. Who knew what kind of chemicals were in his body? He wasn't exactly a picture of health. Kind of gamey looking, if anything. To cut him loose, I had to just start running. Words barely seemed to register. I went until I was out of breath, and when I turned around, I saw no sign of him. It took a while for my heart rate to come down after that. He hadn't actually done anything openly menacing, or even intimidated anything, really. He hadn't said anything threatening, or anything at all. He may have been mute for all I know. I was watching a movie in my head while we walked, of 30 seconds in the future, working myself up with every step. I actually started breathing heavier. Otherwise, we were just walking silently, side by side, while I stared into space and scrutinized detailed images of my own mutilation, what my blood would look like dried on the sidewalk in the morning. I found a divey spot on Royal Street to duck into, as much just to be around other people and off the street as to farther my mission. I found a spot near the end of the bar where I could decompress and ordered a martini to hasten the process. As soon as I was settled, I felt at least 3 pairs of eyes on me. I shrank. What had happened? 20 minutes ago, I had been the predator. I had been in control. And just like that, I was like a slab of meat tossed over the fence into the big cat habitat. I fended off 2 advances from men far too leering, far too large, and not nearly inebriated enough while I finished my drink and then made a hasty exit. There was a cluster of 4 guys standing outside smoking. The one most facing me when I came out the door looked at me, and we made eye contact. He looked down at his shoes right away. Bald spot. Looked like IT, maybe. Then a quick look back up at me, to see if I'd noticed. He smiled sheepishly. About my height? I took the invitation. As I singled him out, I could read the minor relief on the faces of the other 3. Their eagerness to turn away and regroup that told me that they might have been friends, but this balding fellow was just some drunk guy at a bar gnawing on their ear. My new friend, for his part, seemed like he'd miss them about as much. After we made our introductions, and I laughed at one of his jokes, I went back inside to fetch us another round of drinks. And we drank them while we chatted, and the next round was on him. I was surprised when he came back out with them in his hands. I'd half expected him to get the cutoff. The inside was noisy, but the rest of the street was quiet. At a lull in the conversation, I asked him if he wouldn't mind walking me home. He said he would be honored. I looked back as we were leaving to see if there was anyone we ought to wave goodbye to. There was not. By the time we'd arrived at the rental car, I'd cooked up a whole story about where my place actually was, and a bunch of convoluted excuses to try and coax him into the vehicle, in spite of what I'd originally said. I even popped the trunk to show him my new sword, and told him how my brother was a collector and had given it to me as a gift. It's a cavalry saber from the Revolution. But none of it was necessary. When it was time, he simply opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat without a word, as if it had been the agreed-upon plan all along. We headed over the bridge and out of the city. I waited for him to say something, but he did not. I looked over and got the impression he was very much in his own head, and focused on the fact that he was about to have sex. I heard him snoring 20 minutes later. We arrived at the beach house a couple of hours before sunrise. He woke up rubbing his eyes, and I told him that it was my grandma's house. He was groggy and confused, but clearly more sober than when we'd left. I told him to wait in the car and ran round to the side of the house and the propped bathroom window. I turned on a few lights. Without the decor and the crowds of people, the place felt even emptier than I'd remembered. I took the big staircase in the foyer to the second floor and poked my head into the first bedroom. To my relief, there was a bed. To my dismay, no bedding. Oh well. I had to imagine those last few drinks were still in his system somewhere. I went down to the front door and let him in. The first thing he said was, "Is that the fucking ocean?" I had to get him upstairs. I turned up the sex appeal, batted my eyes, put a little pout in my lip. I took his hand and made it to the second step, but he was skeptical. "Isn't that storm coming?" "Not right now." I leaned back and kissed him. That did it. I was grateful to find that there were sheets in the linen closet. It was fine, for what it's worth. He was polite, exceedingly polite. I might have said, under other circumstances, if the sex had been the point of the evening. I went initially for a main course appetizer metaphor here, but scratched it out. If it was any part of a meal, it was something more like the chef visiting the butcher's, inspecting the big slabs of meat, hands on his flanks, kind of bony through the ribs, a paunchy little belly and ample middle-aged subcutaneous flab through the arms and thighs. I'd panicked, and in my fear picked a less than ideal specimen. I would have asked Mr. Butcher for a discount. But oh well, he didn't have to feed a village. When he was finished, he rolled off me and lay there catching his breath until he fell back asleep. I sat up and listened to the waves and had the thought that I ought to do it right then and be done with it. I went downstairs and took the rifle down from above the mantel and tucked it against my shoulder to see how it felt. I'd seen enough movies to figure out how to load a bullet and did so. I went back upstairs and stood outside the bedroom. But the voice urging action for action's sake came from a cold, distant, unfamiliar part of my brain. And the rest of me, the parts that I recognized, reacted against it like white blood cells to a virus. I felt very cold, but I could not tell if the house was cold or if the cold was within me. The parts of my brain that I recognized were urging me to seek the shelter of another person. I was on a mission, but it was impossible not to be intimidated, at least on some base. Goosebumps level, by the storm of the century allegedly bearing down on us. So I put the gun away under the bed. When he woke in the morning, he was smiley and pleasant at first. And then after he'd gone to the bathroom and splashed some water on his face, he came out, and again inquired as to whether or not we ought to be heading away from the ocean as the storm closed in. I told him that we could ride it out. The place had been built by craftsmen. He nodded and said okay, like I'd suggested getting on a spaceship instead. I didn't really have a plan if he tried to leave. I'd never really taken it as a serious possibility that he wouldn't be thrilled to play house and bunker down with me. I'd already resigned myself to the morning sex, and even the potentiality of vacation afternoon lull sex. The thought of weathering the storm alone put the same deep, black pit in my stomach as the tribal chief had when I first saw him on the bank. a power that I could not comprehend, an otherness that could not be translated. "You sure?" he asked. "Has anyone done that before?" "Many times," I said, possibly lying, though in my mind there was about as strong a possibility that I wasn't, considering what I'd seen of folks down here and their attitudes towards these things. That was part of what made this one so different. Nobody seemed to be fucking around about it. Except us, I suppose. I mean, it's still standing, isn't it? 90 years? That's a lot of storms. He bit his lip, but ultimately shrugged and said, "All right," in a way that told me it probably wasn't my sound, fact-based reasoning which was keeping him around. Underneath the comforter, I was still naked. God, it was like pulling thumbtacks out of my thigh trying to be horny or sexual around the guy. I initiated the morning sex just to be done with the whole foreplay aspect of the thing and get on with it. And when it was done, he was laying with his face down, breathing heavily into the pillowcase. And he turned his head just enough to free his mouth to speak and said, "I worked with this guy who met this girl at a bar, like, days before all of the COVID stuff got really serious, and they felt like they were clicking, so they just decided to go into lockdown together. It sounds less crazy when you remember that at the time it was only supposed to be like 2 weeks. But fast forward a few years and they're married with 3 kids. "Wow," I said. "Geez." I mean, not that... I didn't mean... You know, I think you're cool, obviously. I think we'll get along well, but we can totally just see where this goes. I'm not trying to, like, make it weird or imply, like, one day at a time is totally cool with me. That makes sense. I get it. Everyone wants to keep their options open, especially at your age. And, like, I don't even know if I want kids. I mean, I think I do, or at least a part of me does." He stammered a string of other backtracks and equivocations I couldn't really bear to listen to. Luckily, the fridge was well stocked with leftovers of the bar from the reception. It was already nearly noon.
As far as food, pickings were far slimmer. I eventually managed to find some cheese and deli cuts in the garbage that seemed edible and safe, and arrange them for us on a plate. But it could only last so long. I searched for something else, but there was nothing. We played some board games. I tried changing the subject whenever he asked about food, even went so far as to lure him back to bed. But in the end, he would not be put off his pursuit of something to eat, and eventually, in the late afternoon, cornered me and forced me to drive him to the main island. It was a grayish day outside. The skies overhead were clear, but the sun felt cold and distant. The beach was chock absolutely full of seagulls, like an unsettling amount. Almost all of them just standing there, making hardly any noise at all. Out over the sea, the clouds were racing by, but the air around us was almost alarmingly calm. We started the car and drove around the house. The birds in our way moved for us, but the flock itself was too large to be disturbed, if it even was a flock. It seemed to me like it might be something more like a convention of many different flocks. We made our way down to the bridge, only to find it underwater. Things were a bit tense after that. I almost wanted to ask if he was diabetic or something. I'd only ever known women to get that crabby after just 1 or 2 missed meals. He acted like we weren't both hungry, and pretty quickly the illusion vanished, and an awful, low-grade nausea crept up on me and refused to leave. There was no passion or romance building here, no whirlwind chemistry. We were 2 absolute strangers who could have just as easily been standing in line together at the DMV. And yet somehow, it was worse. Because strangers in line at the DMV don't have the knack for getting under my skin the way he was managing to after only knowing him for a matter of hours. After he'd sneezed several times in only a few minutes, even the way he blew his nose made me roll my eyes. And then, just before sunset, as the clouds are rolling in, he finds a pizza in the freezer. Poof! Just like that, we're back in the fantasy. Star-crossed lovers against everything, young and heedless, each the other's whole world. Like heroes of some French New Wave film, writing out the end of the rest of the world together. Why not? Anything to suppress the nausea. Outside, the wind was gaining speed and violence with every minute that passed. Before I know it, he's dragging me back up to the bedroom. And at that point, how could I resist? We all like to feel safe and wanted. But the thing was, my pity for him had been erased. I had, even if it was only for a moment, hated him. It was a dumb, petty hatred, likely born largely of my own caloric shortcomings that left as fast as it had come. I didn't know the man enough to hate him. He simply had a capacity to be annoying. Don't we all? But the important part was that the pity I'd felt from the moment I laid eyes on him, as if he were some kind of stray kitten, was gone. When he came back from washing up, I was still in bed, and I was pointing the gun right at his chest. He froze. I'll never forget the look on his face. I pulled the trigger. Click. I can only imagine what my own face looked like. Pew pew, I said and choked out a laugh. I lowered the barrel. Another confused smile spread across his face. Holy shit. Where'd you find that? He came over to examine it with deference. This has gotta be at least 100 years old. At least, I agreed. My face was on fire. I couldn't believe that he couldn't hear my heart racing. He raised it to the crook of his own shoulder and aimed down the sights at the window. Then he turned and aimed it at me. The muscles in my face went completely slack. It felt like there was static electricity consuming my body, like I was hovering several millimeters above the bed. Incredible, he said, mostly to himself. He lowered it and examined it one more time. Then he came back and started kissing me again. I was too shocked to do anything but let him. We ended up going for it again. Under other circumstances, I would have been impressed. When it was over, I went to pee, and when I returned, the bedroom was empty. I found him downstairs. He turned off some of the lights and was sitting by a large window in the half-dark in the lanai, watching the storm approach. The wind picked up strength, and the lights that were still on flickered for a moment but stayed lit. Every now and then, the sky flashed with lightning and lit up the world outside. The tops of the palm trees were almost scraping the sand. I have a feeling I'm going to regret this, he said, quiet enough that I wasn't sure if I was meant to hear it or if he even knew I was there. He was drinking again. It's really coming, I said. He turned to look at me for the first time, but didn't seem especially surprised to see me there. You said craftsman, right? He had a wry smile. I nodded. Craftsman. There was another painting in the corner, above a record cabinet. Even in the gloom, I recognized the city from the first almost immediately, though it could hardly be said to be the same city. The sky in the painting was not too dissimilar from the one we were looking at out the window. The bridges and statues were crumbling, and the temples were on fire. Boats sinking in the river, dogs feeding on the corpses strewn about the streets. Armies or gangs, or both, fighting in the public square, defiling the fleeing women. The immediacy and scale of the violence and chaos turned my stomach. And yet, to me, it was the most fascinating of the three. It was several minutes before I could tear away from it. Each new scene or vignette I stumbled onto was more horrific, more shameless and depraved than the last. People praying to fallen idols with their final breath. It was several minutes before I could tear myself away from it. "I gotta run to get something from the car," I said. "Your sword?" he asked. I froze. For a second, I thought I wasn't going to be able to speak. "How'd you know?" I tried to make some kind of a laugh, but it was impossible. "You should have brought two," he said, "so we could have a big sword fight, like me and my sister used to growing up." I didn't respond right away, so he kept going. "Not that I think of you like a sister, obviously, of course. I was just, we'd build pillow forts and jump up on couches and stuff like that. It was fun." I said, "I'm a lover, not a fighter." I was glad to already be facing the door so that he couldn't see whatever stricken look I must have had on my face. I surprised myself at how steady I managed to keep my voice. "Oh," he said, thinking that this was some sort of invitation. I guess I could see, under the circumstances, how he might construe that, but it still made my eyes roll all the same. When I went outside, the wind was absolutely howling, like I'd only experienced maybe a handful of times before in my life. If that. The roar of the waves hitting the shore made it difficult to hear anything else. A few miles out over the water, the lightning was nearly constant. I had to catch my balance at first, and then lean against the wind on my way out to the car. I needed to envision, in granular detail, how it was all going to go down. It was one thing to plan in generalities, assign my future self the deed and the means, like picking up a game piece and clue. Carrying it out was another entirely. I would have to do all of it. Nothing could be left to yada yada, so on and so forth. I needed to see where on his naked body that point was going to land. Unless the point was hardly involved at all. Unless it was more of a slashing motion. That seemed inadvisable. There wasn't really any rain yet, but the air was filled with a fine spray that made me squint. And when I brought the sword back inside, I had to wipe my face and wipe the blade on my pants. When I walked back in the door, I still didn't know what I was going to do. But the sword gave me confidence. The Bureau of whatever the fuck will never publish a statistic about it. But I wonder how many people get shot, ultimately, because of how good a Glock feels in your hand. I grabbed a heavy blanket off the couch and tossed it around my neck like a cloak. When he saw me, he called me, "Your Highness." I said, "That's right. I'm the Queen of the Storm. Bow down and kiss the ring so that you can be knighted." He obliged. I was surprised at how calm I was. I was reacting to the moment, letting ideas come. I don't know where the ideas came from. It was as if my limbs were carrying me forward. But then I paid attention and realized that my heart was beating very, very fast. Just like that, the spell was broken, and my hands were trembling. The little bit of light from the other room highlighted the fuzzy, translucent hair on the back of his neck. It made my forearms weak. With the power invested in me by Neptune, I dub thee. I tapped his right shoulder, and then raised the sword high above my head. Knight of the Realm. I swung down as hard as I could. I closed my eyes at the last second. The blade stuck, at least for a second, though the impact stung my hand so hard that I dropped it. There was a spray of blood. I heard the meaty chunk sound, but he was screaming. I remember thinking, my first thought for a split second, how far down are the vocal cords? But his head was still, of course, distressingly attached to his body. He was writhing around cursing and asking what the hell I was doing. I picked up the sword again. Now that it had started, it had to be finished. I thought I would run him through, but he caught it. His palms bled a bit, but he overpowered me and ripped the sword out of my hands. I looked around for a kitchen knife or something to wield. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" he said, backing toward the lanai door to the outside. He held up the sword between us. "Did someone pay you for this?" "Who? Denise?" I just looked at him. There was a big lightning flash, and he ducked out the door and into the darkness. I couldn't move for several minutes. When he got the sword, I thought I was really done for. I'd been ready to beg for my life, grovel, debase myself however he asked. The door was still open, and the storm seemed ready to tear it off its hinges. When I went to close it, I saw that he'd dropped the sword in the yard. I could have sworn that I heard a voice in the distance crying out, but when I tried to listen closer, I couldn't be sure that it wasn't all just the wind. All the same, I followed his tracks in the sand. I didn't know when high tide was, or if the storm surge had already taken out the bridge indefinitely. But he hadn't even made it that far. Not quite. I found his body sprawled out at the foot of the bridge. Dead. No sign of lightning strike. Not a mark on him besides the ones I'd inflicted. And I looked at those again, and decided that there was absolutely no way that that had been what had killed him. It clearly hadn't even paralyzed him. Superficial wounds would, I believe, be a fair classification based on the hundreds of hours of medical dramas I've watched. He had the hand nicks and a decently nasty gouge, and a little chunk of flesh gone from his neck. But I don't believe I even reached the bone. I double and triple checked. He was not breathing. He had no pulse. I looked around for some sign, any difference in the landscape at all, but there were no clues. There was nothing. I was sweating like a pig by the end of it. But I managed to drag him back to the house and even up the porch steps and into the foyer. It seemed like just about as soon as I closed the front door behind us, the storm came down in earnest. It rattled the windows and sent chills up and down my spine that took minutes to subside. The whole house creaked and groaned. I don't really know why I locked the door, but I felt a lot better when I did. I lit a handful of candles, and for at least half an hour, maybe much longer, I sat and listened to the storm. At some point, the power went out. The house had never felt so large, so cavernous. I thought about all of the empty rooms, and yet it had also never felt so small. Such an insignificant piece of flotsam in the midst of that vast ocean. The wind was angry. I might as well have been a fly. Hell, I might have been better off if the worst came to pass. I spent the last 24 or 48 hours, whatever it had been, living almost entirely within my own head, concocting and revising schemes, envisioning how they might play out over and over and over. Whole diverging trees of possible outcomes, examining my own feelings about all of it, interfacing with the physical world around me like it was the person handing me my food at the drive-through window. It had been easy enough to disappear into myself like that with my date around, an outside presence to reinforce my delusion that the world was something separate from myself, another interiority to bounce my own off of. And if one person can provide that, think what shared facade realities thousands and millions can create and sustain together. Suddenly, I was as lone as I'd ever been. A journey from the inside of my mother's womb at the warm center of life and family and society and collective delusion that ended out here as the most isolated, the most remote node, the most solitary point of something in an endless swirling tempest of nothing. Nature is cruel and ironic. It measures time in eons and does things just to make itself laugh. Anyone who thinks that we have or ever could conquer her should sit where I was sitting and hear the wind that I heard, like a freight train. Parts of her can be tamed, at least temporarily, put on display for a nickel. She'll let us build our towers up into the sky, the better to spit in her face, at least for a while. If only because the greater civilization, the grander delusion, and all the more joy she reaps in swiping away forever with a flick of her wrist. Pride goeth, etc. It was probably around midnight, if I had to guess, that my stomach started to grumble. I stared at the body, drying out, face down on the rug. I crawled over to turn him on his back, and my heart skipped a beat at the sheer terror death had etched into his features. It was my first good look at him with some light. He had left the house in some shaken up mixture of disbelief, anger, and, to be sure, horror. But this was something else entirely. I had to put the blanket over him so that I could begin prepping the kitchen. The cupboards were stocked with utensils and a fairly comprehensive, if basic, spice rack. They had a really fancy, really expensive set of knives that I'd noticed during the reception and had been looking forward to using ever since. I brought him into the servants' kitchen for the butchery, which had the added benefit of being one of the best insulated rooms in the house, almost right in the center. I put him on newspaper and covered him up except for the slice of his leg I intended to cut, like he was going in for an operation. But the sight of the skin and the black leg hairs were too much for me, and I had to take a break. The house shook with thunder, and I was overcome with a wave of regret that I had not at least kept him around to pass the brunt of the thing. I went back to the foyer to make sure that everything was still intact and see how the storm was progressing. I stared out the window for so long that I began to see shapes moving down on the beach, passing along the waterfront. Little more than dark smudges, but as I watched them, I became convinced that they were moving of their own volition, not some vapor or vegetation blown in the wind. If I wanted to, I could squint and twist up my face a bit and almost see human figures. But it was difficult to say anything for certain. If I stared too long, it became impossible. in that low light to separate my mind's eye from my eye. I had to take a deep breath to pull myself away. I grabbed a bottle of rum from the fridge and started pouring shots. After a few, I was ready to return to the butcher shop, where I held my breath and just went for it before I could stop myself, with the same sort of white knuckle abandon. I hardly knew the guy and didn't particularly like him, but it felt like it would be a significant black mark on my cosmic permanent record if I were to chicken out and waste his life completely. I soon had a couple half-decent looking cuts of meat, and the blood situation mostly sorted out, or at least contained enough, and I took my prize out to the front of house kitchen, where I had a pan ready to go with some butter. The wind sounded like it was angry at me in particular, the way it screamed and ravaged the shutters, somehow always getting louder, even when you thought it never possibly could. Like its frustration was growing, trying to rip the roof off so it could reach in and grab me. The aromas that soon began to fill the kitchen made my mouth water. I checked my recipe and made sure I had all my spices right, and flipped him when it was time. As strong as my regret earlier had been, doubled is the peace that I felt come over my whole body at this point. The almost narcotic tranquility of a mission fulfilled, a task seen through from conception to fruition, the ecstasy of action, making one's will manifest. So much of life is spent working for other people, or meandering through places and events that lead nowhere, and don't add up to anything in particular. The simple linearity of the conquest was endlessly intoxicating. The warm glow of the rum in my belly didn't hurt either. And then I took him off of the heat, let him rest a bit before plating him on the nicest china I could find, garnishing him, sitting down at the dining room table, and tying a napkin around my neck, cutting myself a bite, putting it in my mouth, and I had to fight to keep from gagging and spitting it right back onto the plate. I screwed up my face and chewed through the revulsion. The texture, the taste. I couldn't even say which was the most offensive. I choked him down and followed it with an entire glass of water. Then I sat still for a long 2 minutes, simply focusing on not barfing. When I tried to take a second bite, I retched. I forced it through my lips, but my body revolted and rejected it. There was half a thing of Sweet Baby Ray's in the fridge, so I slathered it and managed to gulp down a nibble. But it wasn't easy. That was it. It was over. The dream was dead. I hated it. Him. And there was nothing else to eat. Somewhere else in the house, a window shattered. It sounded like bombs were dropping all around. The floor began to tilt. I felt it in my stomach as we were lifted an inch or two off the foundation. Furniture went sliding into walls. Books fell from the shelves. All of the plates and bowls came tumbling out of the cabinets. And then, as quickly as it had started, gravity grabbed hold of us once more and we landed back on solid earth. I hastily patched the guy's wounds so that he wouldn't bleed everywhere, and then took him upstairs with me. If I could fall asleep, then I would no longer be hungry. At least for a few hours. But even in my dream, the gnawing hunger followed. I was at a restaurant. We were actually me and Eric or Aaron. It was an actual date. Except, even though everyone around us was digging into the mountains of food on their plates, which never seemed to diminish despite their constant gorging, minutes passed, and then a half hour passed, and then an hour, and our waiter never brought the food. We eventually flagged him down, and he asked if we were ready to order yet. Then I woke up. My heart stopped for a second when I saw him sitting up in the corner of the bedroom like a big rag doll, even though I'd put him there. Uh, I'm pretty sure I put him there, at least. I was a little shocked to see the empty bottle of rum on the nightstand. It was a clear day, and outside I could hear seagulls. It was exceedingly chilly, and there was a draft that made it feel like I might as well have been outdoors. I went out into the hallway and took 2 steps down the stairs and stopped. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. Like the computer cursor in my brain changed and started spinning in circles. The first floor was underwater, up to the 7th or 8th step, up nearly to the top of the door frames. It made me dizzy enough to grab onto the balustrade. The tide pushed through the windows and sloshed up a few steps beneath where my feet were. I went back upstairs, to the first window that I could find. Water. Everywhere. In every direction. I went around to different rooms to confirm, like I was on a boat out at sea. I paced the length of the upstairs hallway, trying to weather a panic attack. If I, on an airplane, were to start hyperfixating on the thought of falling out of the sky and crashing horribly back into the earth, to the point that it became debilitating, I could always reassure myself that, no matter how absurd it seemed, the airplane was a machine designed for flying, and one which thousands and thousands of people flew safely every day. If on a boat, I start looking overboard into the depths and growing seasick. I can tell myself as often as I need to that the boat is a professionally crafted, thoroughly inspected vessel that can, with full confidence, be expected to ferry me to wherever I am headed, safe and dry, whether I fully comprehend the physics of buoyancy or not. The house, no matter how beautifully decorated, offered no such stable ground, literally or mentally. For all I knew, I realized the house may have detached in the wind, broken off from the foundation, and been carried out to open ocean by the waves. I went window to see if I could see land anywhere, but through the haze I could not. My stomach sank deeper and deeper at each new identical vista. But I stopped for a second and thought more about it. I'd been on boats. It did not feel like I was on a boat, subject to the waves and the wind. The floor felt as solid as it ever had. This helped slow my heart rate down a bit. I went to the bathroom and found that the sink still worked, which I took to be a miracle in itself, even taking for granted that the house was still attached. I filled the sink and tub with water. Back in the bedroom, I was disturbed to find Aaron or Eric smiling at me. I shrieked as if he were about to start talking to me, but the reality was that his face looked mostly the same. Except that I was quite sure, though not convinced, that the corners of his lips had turned subtly upward. Maybe it was something caused by whatever constriction the muscles experienced in death. Maybe it had always been that way. I'd only seen him in dim light. It could have been what I guess you might call a Mona Lisa sort of effect. Whatever the explanation, it gave me debilitating heebie-jeebies, and I turned him around to face the wall. In the afternoon, I heard thunder in the distance, but the sky was only dark for a couple of minutes. I'd been hoping, while simultaneously attempting to suppress any voicing of said hope, even inside of my own head, for fear of somehow jinxing it, that this was just some freak tide that would roll back out in a couple of hours. I passed the long afternoon waiting for something that I knew probably wasn't going to come, praying for it to come, my little candle flame of faith dwindling with the setting sun. Weeks. The word echoed around the vacancy left in my skull by the evacuated belief. That was all I knew. How long could it stay like this? How long might it be till rescue? How long could a person live without food? That last one, I wasn't as sure about. I knew it like I knew that my body was 70% water, but the volume of the obscene noises that were coming from my stomach suggested I'd be hard-pressed to last another 72 hours. I decided that in the morning I would attempt to swim for it. The idea made me break out in a cold sweat, but I convinced myself that it was feasible. I'd grab a board, or something, and use it to float whenever I got tired. And those other islands were close enough. Surely over there the people would have something worked out, or at least some information for me, and some food. Staring up at the stars was the only way to pass the time besides sleeping that condensed the hours into minutes, rather than expanding each excruciating minute to feel like an hour. I'd only seen the sky so full of them once before, on a camping trip to the Upper Peninsula with my father when I was a child. In my dream, my date was talking. I wasn't comfortable, but I wasn't out of my mind with fear like I should have been. He was bleeding black all over the chair. He didn't look any more alive than he did in waking life. "The ground spit me right back out," he said. "It wouldn't have me," he kept repeating himself. "It spit me right back out." I noticed that the sound of the ocean was absent, and I got up from bed to look out the window. We were in the middle of a moonlit city of the dead. From our vantage point, I could see dozens of narrow lanes lined with mossy stone vaults. When I woke up, it was still dark. I went out to the top of the stairs to make sure that if the water was not receding, it was at least not rising either. I went down to the lowest dry step and squatted to look into the foyer. It seemed about the same, moonlight reflecting off the ripples of the black water. It was kind of captivating in its surreality. The kerplunk sound of something surfacing or going beneath the water snapped me out of a trance. It sounded like it had come from the kitchen or billiards room. I held my breath. It was as if my blood stilled itself for a moment so that I could hear better. I thought that I saw a pattern in the ripples, a section of finer ripples moving in a broad chevron, cutting through the hallway in my direction. Then I lost track of it, and couldn't be sure it had ever been anything more than a projection of my imagination. But I didn't stop holding my breath, and I didn't blink as I scanned the uniform void of the water around me for some change, an errant air bubble to catch a glint of moonlight. I saw no such thing, but the pit of my stomach forced me to take a few steps back anyways, and I was glad that I did. As I was about to turn and retreat back to the top of the stairs, something broke the surface of the water. Still only half a dozen steps beneath me. Long black hair, glistening, dripping, shrouding a head with bulging white eyes. Someone was walking up the steps. I ran to the top and turned back to look. It was the chief. He was carrying the largest of the expensive kitchen knives, which caught the moonlight in full. The water fell off of him in buckets. His movements were heavy and plodding, and he took each step with methodical precision. I don't think he was blinking either. I ran back down the hall to the room where I'd been sleeping and closed and locked the door behind me. I heard him at the top of the landing, dripping. I held my breath to listen, but soon I couldn't tell if he was there or not anymore. I did not dare open the door. I would not even go near it. the next time I woke up. Even though it was light out, it took several minutes to mostly convince myself that I was no longer dreaming. It wasn't helped, or maybe it was, by the massive pelican staring at me from the corner armchair. I flinched when it rustled its feathers, but goddamn if my heart wasn't about to beat out my chest when I finally worked up the nerve to open the door. He wasn't there. But I never quite shook the feeling that, I don't know. It sure didn't feel like most dreams. It was another clear day, and though the breeze was brisk, the sun was warm. I was rested and ready to make the big swim. I took a long time to steel myself mentally, and then made my way out to the stairs. The water was where it had been. I took the balustrade in one hand and made my way down to the bottom dry step and took a deep breath. He wasn't going to be there. I knew that. I told myself that I knew that. I planted my feet on the next step and let my ankles acclimate. It was cold, but not unbearable. I knew what they said about floodwater, but this was practically the ocean. The ocean diluted literally everything. My heart was going faster, but I took control of my breathing and soon was able to take another step. Before long, I was in up to my chest. I wouldn't be able to stand at the bottom of the stairs, so I sat on top of the balustrade and planned my route across the room to the front door. I had just pushed off. The momentum carried me to the center of the room, when I saw something in the doorway break the mirrored slate surface of the water. A spiny, muckish brown square of dinosaur, an alligator back on the move. I don't know if I've ever swam so fast in my life. I'd gone all of 15 or 20 feet and back, and my heart was thudding so hard that it physically hurt my ribs. My lungs wanted more room to expand than my ribs would allow. I heard something break the water's surface again, somewhere behind me. But I never turned around to look. I may have touched the floor twice on my way back to the bedroom. By the time I was hungry enough to consider it, my date had started to stink. I checked his wound and found tiny little worms poking around. I considered sending him out to sea, but worried that I would miss his company, or that he'd just get to shore before me and someone would find him. I considered going on the roof, and maybe even trying to spell out some kind of message like I'd seen people do on the news. But getting up there seemed like a dangerous proposition, and in my current state, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to be rescued. This man was a victim of the storm. That much was true. Nobody should see any reason to doubt that. And I saw no reason why I should be connected to his death. I considered taking one of the doors from its hinges and using it as a raft. But that idea ended as soon as I imagined seeing a shark fin in the water 5 miles out from any land. The truth is, I don't remember much of what happened after that, which, in some ways, makes me more unsettled than any alligator. I didn't lose any limbs. According to the calendar, I lost 11 days. According to the scale, almost 23 pounds. The only explanation that makes any sense to me is that my mind is covering up whatever happened at that time to try and protect me from it. Or maybe I just didn't have the caloric horses to be forming any new memories. The next thing I do remember was waking up to the sound of the storm door opening downstairs. I felt lightheaded when I saw that all the water was gone, probably in part from standing up too fast. A stout, little, middle-aged Guatemalan woman with a bucket of cleaning supplies in her hand and her hair in a ponytail was standing in the entryway. She screamed when she saw me. I will never forget The view from the passenger window of that woman's van as she drove me, emaciated, back to civilization. The desolation, trees uprooted, entire neighborhoods and shopping centers flattened. Piles of rubber everywhere you looked and very little else. Like the wind had wiped the landscape clean with the back of its hand and said, "Nope, start over." It seemed as if the whole world had ended. We had to drive a long time until we came to a place where it had not. Life feels kind of hollow now, to tell you the truth. I'm glad to be alive, obviously. But it's all just sort of one note. Like every sensation gets blunted and put into a blender and turned into a beige paste. My mother says I should go to therapy. I say maybe and change the subject and put her off. Maybe it would help, sure. They say it's all about finding the right therapist. All right, I believe it. And maybe in our first session, I'll read to her from this diary and we can go from there.
Возьму здесь снегер, а?
Возьму здесь снегер.
Let me tell you something. Uncle Joe, it's raining and the people are so fine to stay around. And how great it is. Oh, it makes me feel happy.
Oh, yeah.
Just to know we can start in the rain and sing.
That's what I'm talking.
And the people are so sweet to stay
Oh,
here.
it gets sweet.
And I come in on a...
Yeah.
Let me tell you what I come in on. Oh, yeah! Get the key. Didn't it rain, children? Rain, oh yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, didn't it? Oh, yes, how it rained. I said it rained, children. Rain, oh yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, or didn't it? Oh my Lord, how it rained. You know it rained 40 days, rained 40 nights to make my garment fit me right. When I get to heaven, gonna put on my robe, walk around in glory, tell the glad news. Look up David in the heat of the day, tune up a harp and begin to play. I know it rained, you know it rained. Oh, how it rained, rained too long, all night long. Rain, 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 rain. Didn't it rain, children? Rain, oh yes. Didn't it, yes. Didn't it, you know it did, or didn't it? Oh my Lord, how it rained. Some at the window, some at the door, some crying, Brother Noah, can't you take on more? But no cried out, my friends. The angel's got the key and you can't get in. I know it rain, you know it rain. Rain too long, all night long. Rain all day, rain all night. Rain, 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 rain. yes. Didn't it, yes. Didn't it, you know it, didn't it? Oh, my Lord. How it rained.